I have the great pleasure to introduce my dear friend Michael Bentley. And he's one of those people, whenever I speak to him, I feel the presence of a distinguished, dignified soul. And what it does to me is that I feel dignified myself in return. That is a gift some people have, and Michael Bentley is one of them. To me, he's a philosopher, poet in the classical sense, allured by the love for wisdom and the desire to know thyself in order to receive the universal principles and to know God. Whatever his calling is, I know it will be guided by greatness, in service of the virtues of the true, the good, and the beautiful. But most of all, he's a dear friend of mine, and I trust him with my life. So, with great pleasure and honor, Michael Bentley.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah? All right. So, first of all, I promised Shannon that I would share poetry, so I'm going to start with that. Actually, before I do that, I wanted to make a correction in my title. It's supposed to be Barbarian Beauty, How to Lay Siege on the Thought of Greek Thought in 5 Uneasy Steps. It says Greek Thought, which is even more radical than I intended to be. So this piece is called The Good and What is Bad. Your life thus far has been nothing but the love of light. But me, I am the darkness that blinds, the death that heals, and the sin that redeems. Drink me down, blacker than bitterness and bigger than blame. I am not merely what you hate, I am your love of your hatred. Drink as if your survival and your salvation depended upon it. Sip me if you wish, but swallow me you must. Even with your mouth overfed and your belly ever starving, drink. Even as your words uttered in the language of an obsolete mythology are drowned out by the size of my title, still go on and drink. Even if it means your bloated, bobbing body reaches no further than my surface and floats there, headstrong, face down, with your back turned coward-like away from my heights. Even as your lifeless eyes stare dumbly into my depths, drink, because you thus far have been nothing but the fear of me. Drink me down until you are drunken with my spirits. Drink until you come upon the message in my bottle. Only what kills you will make you stronger. Yeah. All right, so I guess I should start with a disclaimer about why I want to lay siege on the thought of Greek thought. First, by laying siege, I hope to suggest that there's a kind of philosophy or a part of philosophy that is not always controlled by tradition, and there's a space into which we can move so that we can have a distance from philosophy so as to ask the question of what it is and to critique what it has been and to create what it can become. And I wanted to share why it's personal for me. And to do that, I guess I can ask you a question. Does anybody know what my last name is? Bentley, right? Does that seem strange to anybody? My immediate family is Jamaican, and my ancestors, so they tell me, are from Africa. And yet I have this name that comes from England, right? So I share that to hopefully begin to suggest why the search for a part of me that is in excess to tradition and in excess to my name, my English name, why I need for that to exist, right? And for me, philosophy has been sort of a emancipatory practice that helps me to find that part of myself. So if it turns out that there is no philosophy outside of the tradition that gave me that name, then that's a problem. Right. I've been thinking a lot about what Rick said earlier this week about Nietzsche, when he said that Nietzsche's goal was basically to wipe out the horizon of meaning, which for the most part I agree with, but I wanted to qualify that understanding of Nietzsche and suggest that what he wanted to do was to wipe out the boundary of meaning, right? So in the death of God, you have the suggestion that there is no ultimate frame of reference. I like to say frame of reference instead of ENCE, it's ENTS, so that there is no ultimate grammar that dictates how language should be used or what a value can be. I really think this is what drove Nietzsche to go so-called beyond good and evil. He wanted to see if there was something beyond our fundamental distinctions, right? So I hope I can use that to explain why I chose the term barbarian. For those who don't know, barbarians or barbarianism is a term in multiple traditions, not just Greek tradition. I'm laying siege on tradition as a whole, not just Greek tradition. So it's a term that was used to designate anything that is non-Greek. So it's sort of a negative identity. You are a barbarian if you're not a citizen of Athens or you're not a Greek, basically. And this kind of thinking pops up in a lot of different traditions, but it's a sort of fundamental distinction that it's very difficult to question if you think the activity of questioning only takes place on one side of that boundary. So by using the term barbarian, I'm asking what non-Greek thought has to say about philosophy that might not be able to be said from within the boundary of Greek thought. Part of my journey has been to look for a foil to Socrates. And by foil, I don't mean necessarily an opponent, but someone who's more Socratic than Socrates in a sense. My first encounter with Socrates when I was younger and reading about him in the Platonic dialogues, I was convinced that Socrates was a rebel. He was revolutionary, and hence why he was killed. But as I became schooled in philosophy, I realized that just like Drew points out about Martin Luther King, his Socrates' image is sort of vanillified and watered down, and we lose what was so radical about him and his questioning. So in the search for a foil, I came across just recently a figure named Anarchist, and he's actually mentioned in the Republic when Plato is laying siege on the poetic tradition, and he's saying that if he could, he would ask Homer, what have you contributed Excuse me, just ate too much. What have you contributed to society, basically? What city have you built? And he gives examples of people who have contributed to society. He names 2 inventors, a Narcissus, and I forget who the other one is. So I did some research to figure out who a Narcissus was, because I've been very much into the thought of anarchy and trying to figure out what that means. And I was wondering if etymologically, anarchissus was the inspiration for the word anarchy. And I found out that anarchissus was supposedly a 6th century philosopher, barbarian philosopher, who was the first foreigner to gain Athenian citizenship. And he went to Athens in a search for knowledge. He wanted to learn about their customs and traditions. And he went specifically to a character named Solon or Solon, who was hired, or I don't know how he or why he decided to do this or needed to do this, but he was trying to create laws for Athens, a legal code. So Anarchissus wanted to dialogue with him, and the only words that are attributed to Anarchissus, because we don't have any of his writings, which is part of what excites me about the figure. He's just sort of this enigma, which is how I always interpret historical figures, whether it be Plato, Socrates. It's sort of a character. So the only words really that are attributed to Anarchissus are these here. He says, "Laws are spider webs which catch the little flies but not the big ones." So my hope today is for us to become big flies and to break some laws and to do some thinking. So I came up with 5 uneasy steps to thinking outside of Greek thought. And the first of these steps is to know thyself. N-O, thyself. And this sort of rule or suggestion came from the questioning of myself that comes from asking, what's the deal with my name? Who am I? What am I if I'm not this name? Only later on, while I was studying the history of philosophy, did I realize how central this question is to philosophy itself, the question of who are you, what are you? This is what drives philosophy, so I see now that it's a blessing that I was forced to ask the question of who I am. So that's why that's the first rule, is to sort of just suggest that we all ask who we are, so that we can begin to do philosophy based on that questionability. And one more reminder before I move on, I wanted to point out that for me, philosophy is, my goal for philosophy is always aesthetic, soteriological, or pedagogical. So even when I do ontology or metaphysics, it's not so much about convincing someone what's true. It's hopefully showing someone what's beautiful about the world we already live in, or what's therapeutic about the activity of philosophy, or figuring out how we can teach philosophy in a way that doesn't become hegemony. So let's see what my time is. To allay some fears that I might want to do away with philosophers that have come before me, I'm going to read some Heidegger. And I hope this proves that I have a deep appreciation for philosophers. I think every philosopher in history was a philosopher because they were rebelling, or because they were questioning everything. It's only sort of our interpretation of what they do that I think leads to issues. And Heidegger says something very similar in this passage. He says, he's talking about the question of being, which for him is the foundation of philosophy, to ask the question of being. He says, questions are and are only as they are actually asked. A leading into the asking of the fundamental questions is consequently not a going to something that lies and stands somewhere. No, this leading to must first awaken and create the questioning. The leading is itself a questioning advance, a preliminary questioning. It is a leading for which in the very nature of things there can be no following. When we hear of disciples, followers, as in a school of philosophy, for example, it means that the nature of questioning is misunderstood. Such schools can exist only in the domain of scientific and technical work. Here, everything has its definite hierarchical order. This work is also an indispensable part of philosophy and has today been lost. But the best technical ability can never replace the actual power of seeing and inquiring and speaking. This, I think, is Heidegger in philosophy, a tradition of philosophy at its best. But what's ironic is that Heidegger goes on to say that, first of all, the question of being is fundamental. It is how a spirit is actualized. It's how we find ourselves and wake up to the world. And then he somehow goes on to say that this question of being is the destiny of the West. I'm not sure what the logic is, how you get from the one to the other, but I think that sort of misstep is exactly where philosophy, as it becomes a tradition, goes wrong. So I want to highlight the initial questioning and the question as what sort of unites us all and opens us to the opportunity to become philosophers. The initial question of being, which for him was, why is there something rather than nothing? But he admits later on that the more primary version of this question is just being, well, this is my words, but being question mark, right? So with that in mind, I wanted to go to our next definition, our next rule, which is to defy definition. I hope now that there's a little bit more subtlety to this idea of laying siege, so that you can see that by defy definition, I don't mean reactionary denial of definition. I actually want to suggest an identification with the denial of definition, right? So I think the denial of definition is actually a part of nature. It's ontological. It's not just something that I'm doing as a reaction to either a system or a tradition. The denial of definition is the question of being for me. I think there's something about being that questions itself, and in that way sort of doubts itself and opens up a space for itself to be rediscovered. And we see this show up countless times in philosophy. But first I want to point out a time which resonates deeply for me. And you all know Malcolm X, right? That X to me is a denial of his definition. It's his identification with the effort to go beyond what he's been named by a tradition, right? He's naming himself that X. And this sort of affirmative doubt shows up in key points in philosophy. Nietzsche's obsessed with it, of course, but the philosophy of Descartes is also driven by this. He doubts everything, including himself. And then he comes back with a certainty. I think, therefore I am. In the same way that I think we can sort of edit Heidegger's question of being, I think we can edit the cogito. And I've called it before the colored cogito, because I think this is what is latent in the experience of marginalized people. And that's I am question mark. I think that is the beginning of subjectivity. It's the questioning of oneself. It's not the certainty, I think, therefore I am. It's I think, therefore I am question mark, or simply I am question mark. Or am I? I think that is the beginning of subjectivity. And there are a few interesting systems that I've come across lately that help to sort of systematize what I want to do here. One of them is the philosophy of Esalen Badiou, and 30 minutes is rather short. All right, but I'll wrap up here and then see if we have questions. The rest of it is implied. So Badiou wants to resist repetition, and he's trying to figure out how novelty is possible. So he searches for the political subject, and he believes the subject is sort of an agent of force. He thinks we begin with the situation, and the situation has its laws, and the subject is that person that is outside of the situation somehow. It's not accounted for by the situation. And therefore has to break out of the situation. So he says there are 4 truth-generating activities. There's politics, science, art, and love. And he says that these are the activities in which we discover our subjectivity and create truths. And philosophy for him is just sort of a distance from those that we set about sort of accounting for the compossibility, or explaining how all of those activities are possible at once. So for him, there is no philosophical subject. Subjectivity is only arises in those 4 activities. So this is where I kind of stray from him, even though I love his system and what he's trying to do. I think there is a philosophical subject, and this philosophical subject is the question of being, or just the pure question ontologically. Shows up also as the epoche, the suspended judgment. I think this is what our subjectivity is. And for whoever was at my presentation last year, I talked about the back sides of things. That thing which is hidden by what's presented. I hope you can see how I tried to connect, how and why I tried to connect that to subjectivity. It is exactly what is hidden and what brings into question your so-called complete knowledge of what this thing is. And that happens everywhere and with everything. There's a hidden side that brings into question what you're seeing and your attempt to name it or to claim complete knowledge of it. So basically the subjectivity is that space in which we can be radicals and question everything. And to know nonsense. And to transgress transcendence and say what cannot be said. And my hope is that we can ontologize this sort of radical freedom and do away with the belief that meaning disappears once you don't have a hegemonic system of meaning. I think meaning arises in each of us, and somehow miraculously we agree on it. And I think we should break that ecclesiastical law of not trusting in thine own wisdom and trust in our wisdom, and how we arrive at agreement and order. All right, we got 4 minutes for questions.
That was awesome. 2 sort of comments that I would like your reaction to. One is, have you considered just really challenging that notion that Greece is a pure, like Greek philosophy is some kind of a pure entity that hasn't been influenced by Egypt,
right?
India, etc.
I consider that, but I didn't want the argument against it to be strictly historical once again. 'Cause I think eventually we just have to move into a space where we can question what history is, period. I mean, because you can flip the whole Greek barbarian system of identification and say what is Greece is everything that's not barbarian. So whatever is termed Greek thought has always been a reaction to this fear of speaking nonsense or speaking incorrectly, or losing meaning, and there's these sort of fears that I think have driven what we call the Greek tradition, or any tradition. So I mean, going back to my own sort of cultural difficulties, a lot of not a lot, but some of my fellow minorities, they really get something from sort of going beyond that historical horizon that's sort of blocked off to us. Like, we don't know where we came from. I don't think anyone knows where they came from, but it's especially obvious, you know, when you're always reminded of it, right? So we attach to the history of the Moors and, you know, these black kingdoms, you know, and I think it's the same thing. Like, I think it's a problem that we always want to legitimize who we are presently by some narrative. So it wouldn't be right for me to question the imposition of that on me and my own identification by doing the same exact thing, you know?
It's a problem not because we shouldn't narrate our experience, but
no.
question that narrative.
Yeah, so that we can move into the space where narratives are created. What's brilliant about the tradition of Greek philosophy or Greek thought is its creative genius. Like the insistence on having a consistent linguistics frame or a conceptual frame or a narrative frame. It's brilliant, the effort that's put into it, you know. But that's what should be appreciated, not Greek thought or this narrative frame as a fact, but this phenomenon as a creative project.
Yeah, thanks for doing what I said. Brilliant. And it sounded to me like the backside of God. And I wonder how you might relate the spirit or the soul, maybe. That's better representative of the moment too, if you're confident.
I like that you said the backside of God, because it brings me back to Nietzsche. I think Nietzsche was the theist. Like, to claim the death of God, I think any radical atheism to me is just the real desire to know God and know God beyond whatever you can convince yourself about God. Like, Heidegger talks about how, you know, we are extended out into nothingness. I think to sort of ontologize that and understand that God itself is an extension out into nothingness, so that, you know, the death of God is the redemption of death, and to say, is God death also? You know, it's an attempt to redeem even the things that we think are irredeemable. So I mean, yeah, it's kind of also what that poem was supposed to be about: the good and what is bad. It's all already redeemed. Ugly is beautiful. Evil is good.
Someone else. Granted that Hegel can be perceived as hegemony in philosophy par excellence.
Right.
I'm wondering if you're familiar with the master-slave dialectic in the phenomenology of spirit, and the way that the oppressed actually are at the forefront of the evolution of consciousness, because the master is alienated from their own connection to the real world, whereas those who are oppressed and enslaved are actually dealing with matter, shaping the world, you know, for the sake of the master, but they experience a deeper form of consciousness and a deeper connection with themselves and with the objects in the world than the master does. And in that way, the oppressed are in the perfect position to philosophize.
Right.
And you know, you get this in like Stoics. You could be involved in politics at high levels of state, but you could also be a slave.
Right.
And I think there is in the tradition this examples of the oppressed doing philosophy in a living way, I think.
Right, yeah. I mean, this is sort of why I suggested it's a blessing that it's a blessing to have your subjectivity questioned, you know, because then philosophy is forced upon you, as opposed to, you know, you can study philosophy for years and never actually bring everything into question, like risk that, and then you'd never become a philosopher. And this is one of my favorite parts this week, was when Becca was saying, you know, I don't know what philosophy is, and therefore I don't know if I'm a philosopher. The question of philosophy and the question of who you are one question, I think. And I mean, that's why it was beautiful to see Richard sort of offer that reaffirmation, like, you're only a philosopher if you're completely questioning yourself. And I mean, it's some sort of like sick cultural project where we force other people to question themselves so that we can watch them do it. And you know, like, I mean, but we're all tied up in it, and I think that is the inside of the master-slave narrative. But I think it can be done by getting. We don't need the notions of master and slave to do it. We're human, and because of that, well, we're alive, and because of that, we're in question. You know.
This seems like a process of really self-individuation.
Yeah.
It's strictly in solitude that we can radically question ourselves.
Right.
So is philosophy an affirmation that we're strictly alone? Because that's what it feels when you're questioning God, or when you see these characters or philosophers like Heidegger and Nietzsche. Mm-hmm. You see that when you're in that state of radical encounter with the question of your own being, and that's the only way to proceed in determination, you're strictly alone.
Right.
So are we strictly to make philosophy, to make progress, to be creative? We have to accept the fact that we're alone.
I think, and this is why I love paradox so much, because it's a way out of what seems like a boundary or an impossibility. We're united in our aloneness. And to me, that's what's so beautiful about anarchy. It's first the crisis of realizing that you have to accept the burden of your own freedom, your own life, your own definition, but then realizing that everyone is united in that. We're all trying to do that. And I mean, my skepticisms about some community or some society is that it becomes an attempt to avoid this question of being alone, so that you can never actually come into real communion about what is most questionable about each of us. I think in this denial of definition, people are always like, well, no, because then distinction it goes away. You can't distinguish. But no, it's because things are so alone in their distinction that they can meld together and come into a relationship. But I mean, these sorts of contradictions they're not allowed by the logic that we think begins philosophy, and this is why philosophy has to step outside of logic. But yeah, we're alone. We're together in it.
I really like your response to that. I just wanted to add that, if we take a look at ancient Greek philosophy, it does have this contemplative dimension that you're referring to, that requires a certain solitude and quiet. But at the same time, philosophy, one of the core practices of philosophy is friendship. And one of the core ways in which our own inquiry is deepened is by being corrected by others, and sort of having that kind of dialectic. So anyway, I just wanted to add that to it. And Michael, I'm glad you affirmed the paradox of that.
To push it even further, Nietzsche says that he can only be friends with his enemies. You can only really respect his enemies. I think I'm way over time, and I don't want to get into Chris's thing.